Natalie Hall spent most of her life on her grandmother's farm, which became her home. The woman's parents died in a plane crash during a flight to Alaska. There were geologists who were out exploring the promising deposits of that harsh region. After the death of her parents, her grandmother, Rosemary Hall, got custody of the 5-year-old Natalie. Despite her advanced age, Rosemary managed to farm on her own and was held in high esteem by the locals. Moreover, Rosemary Hall knew her way around all the kinds of herbs and roots, which she used to prepare healing decoctions and tinctures. It was her grandmother who instilled a love for medicine in Natalie, which ultimately predetermined her fate. After graduation, the young woman went to med school, which she later graduated from with honors. At the same time, Natalie also got therapeutic massage and manual therapy training. "My granddaughter's so smart. She must take after me," Mrs. Hall used to say proudly. There was definitely truth to the old woman's words, and anyone who knew Natalie personally completely agreed with Mrs. Hall. But when the time came for the young woman to find a job, she couldn't seem to do it. First of all, she realized that there was a lot of work on the farm and that she couldn't leave her grandma without help. "You shouldn't have to stay here with me. You need to start thinking about your own life. Mine's almost over, after all," Mrs. Hall said. "Come on, Grandma, you're still young," Natalie answered. Thus, Natalie's grandmother became her first and only patient. The responsible granddaughter gave Mrs. Hall injections, applied a special rub to her sore lower back, and diligently monitored her blood pressure. Since Mrs. Hall's farm was located far from the city center, Natalie often had to go downtown to get her grandmother's meds. The young woman tried to make sure that she got some extra meds so as to be prepared in case her grandma would get worse. It was during one of those trips that she met Francis Young. Ironically, the young man went to the same drugstore as Natalie to buy medicine for his grandfather. It just so happened that the young people bumped into each other at the checkout, causing Natalie to drop her money. "Oh, I'm sorry. It's my fault," the young man exclaimed and immediately started picking up the change. Natalie blushed deeply and lowered her eyes in embarrassment. 10 minutes later, the two of them had already bought everything they needed and were already sitting on a bench near the pharmacy. Laughing out loud, the young people chatted about everything in the world and looked like they'd been friends for a long time. Natalie hadn't met anyone as interesting before. Francis was smart and well-read, but more importantly, he didn't have that air of obnoxiousness about him, which so many young men of this age do. He didn't speak much about himself, but seemed genuinely interested in Natalie. The young woman openly told Francis that she grew up on a farm and was raised by her grandmother. Natalie always told the truth and didn't see anything shameful in it. But to her own disappointment, Francis didn't find the courage to tell Natalie that he grew up in a wealthy family and was actually a millionaire son. His father, Andrew Young, died 6 months ago in a car accident, and his grandfather had recently fallen off a cliff while climbing a mountain with his team. Fortunately, Richard Young managed to survive, but he'd been in a coma ever since. It's hard to say why Richard didn't tell Natalie any of it. He was probably embarrassed about his wealth and was afraid that Natalie would see him as one of those rich kids who threw their parents money left and right and never achieved anything on their own. Of course, his lies made Francis feel rather uncomfortable, but it was something he was willing to put up with. Giving Natalie some evasive answers, the young man tried to come up with an alternative life story for himself. Having walked Natalie to the bus stop, Francis asked if he could see her again the next day. To the young man's great joy, his new friend agreed. Ever since then, the young people started seeing each other regularly, which didn't go unnoticed by Rosemary Hall. "Who are you seeing, honey? Please don't try and tell me that you're going into town every day on business," Mrs. Hall asked, looking her granddaughter in the eyes. "Yes, Grandma, you're right. I met a man. He seems perfect. Exactly the kind of person I've been looking for so long," Natalie answered. Rosemary Hall furrowed her brows in response to this. The old woman was very worried that her granddaughter might repeat her mistakes. Rosemary never spoke about her past and tried to keep it a secret. However, some of the older people in town remember how wild Rosemary Hall was in her youth. Meanwhile, the elderly woman was always very wary of Natalie's new friend, urged her granddaughter to be careful. But Natalie didn't see anything wrong with her relationship with Francis and strongly believed that the two of them would be fine. And then, for reasons the young couple had no control over, they had to stay apart for a while. They had to do it because Francis needed to deal with the problems his late father's business was going through. Of course, sticking to his legend, the young man didn't tell Natalie about any of it, but instead he came up with a different explanation for why he had to be gone for a bit. It just so happened that after the death of Andrew Young, his wife took over the management of the company. Amanda Young wasn't Francis's biological mother. Andrew's first wife, Francis's mother, died in childbirth. Francis's stepmother had always been a headstrong and rather cruel woman, which caused the company's staff to quit, and that in turn interfered with the business. Francis, on the contrary, was a composed and level-headed person, and thus his subordinates loved and respected him just as much as they did his late father. Therefore, Francis went to one of the company's branches in order to deal with some issues and try to get the profits back to their previous levels. Meanwhile, Natalie was facing a serious problem in her life. It was mainly caused by the fact that Rosemary's health was deteriorating quickly. One day, the woman simply couldn't get out of bed. She was having chest pains and just lay in bed for hours. When Natalie called an ambulance, it turned out that her grandmother was having a heart attack, brought on by a progressing heart disease. The cardiologist's verdict was devastating. "Your grandmother needs surgery, and she needs it as soon as possible," the cardiothoracic surgeon said. But when Natalie heard how much the surgery would cost her, she started panicking. The young woman didn't have that kind of money, and even if she decided to sell the farm, the proceeds would only cover a third of the amount. Natalie realized that she needed to find a job. Moreover, she needed to find it as soon as possible, since Rosemary Hall's disease continued to progress rapidly. Unfortunately, all of Natalie's attempts to quickly find a job ended in failure. The young woman started feeling hopeless, but then help came from where she least expected it. Still trying to keep his financial prosperity a secret, Francis decided to find a way to help his friend nonetheless. The businessman was going to pay for half of the bill for the surgery, but the young woman insisted that she needed to pay the other half herself, which made Francis respect her even more. It was then that the young man came up with an interesting idea. Although Francis's grandfather was discharged from the hospital, he was still in a coma and needed round-the-clock medical assistance. For some inexplicable reason, finding a caregiver for Richard was extremely difficult. It was either that Francis's stepmother was too harsh on the candidates, or they weren't satisfied with the pay, but the fact remained that there was no one to take care of Richard Young. Of course, Francis didn't tell Natalie that his grandfather was a millionaire. To the delight of the young man, Natalie gladly agreed to become his grandfather's caregiver. However, Amanda Young was once again dissatisfied with the new person working in the house. "Where did you even find her? Does she even know how to give injections?" the woman said caustically. But there was no changing Francis's mind. The young man never really got along with the stepmother, so he didn't care about her opinion all that much, truly believing that she was wrong about Natalie. Francis was confident that Natalie was the right person for his grandfather. Natalie found her first day at the job to be quite all right and didn't see a problem in taking care of the old man in a coma. Her duties included monitoring the patient's condition, changing his bedding, and making sure to prevent pressure ulcers. Meanwhile, the young woman couldn't help but feel hostility emanating from Amanda Young, who was the old man's daughter-in-law. "Why does she see an enemy in me? I didn't do anything wrong, did I?" Natalie thought to herself. The next days in the young woman's life were full of hard work and responsibilities. During the day, Natalie looked after Richard Young, and in the evening, she hurried to see her grandmother in the hospital. In order to speed up the treatment process, Natalie accepted Francis's help to make the first payment for the surgery. Meanwhile, Richard Young was in a coma, and no one could say exactly when the man would come out of it, or if he would come out of it at all. Even though he was an experienced climber, it was rumored that he'd made a mistake that caused him to fall from a height of about 100 feet. The fact that he survived at all was a true miracle. However, as the investigation later revealed, his fall was caused by a torn rope, which looked like it could have been cut with a sharp rock. Nevertheless, the investigation didn't see evidence of criminal activity, and thus it was concluded that Richard's fall was an accident. Taking care of the sick old man, Natalie always performed all of her duties to the best of her abilities, never skimping on any of them. Unlike most caregivers, the young woman didn't feel squeamish about the elderly man and always talked to him while changing the bedding or checking his blood pressure. Natalie told Richard Young about herself, her grandmother, and her childhood on the farm. Of course, no one believed that all that talking would bring any result. No one except Natalie and Francis saw Richard Young as a person anymore, believing that he would remain in a coma for the rest of his days. This went on for about a month, after which the caregiver started noticing something strange. Those were mainly the slight changes in the position of Richard Young's body. For some inexplicable reason, the blanket that Natalie used to cover the old man would end up on the floor from time to time. Moreover, the elderly businessman's body changed its position, as if someone was deliberately turning him over while Natalie was away. What's going on here? Why is the blanket on the floor? It's not like the wind could have blown it off, thought Natalie. Like any attentive caregiver, the young woman noticed all the subtle changes that happened to Richard Young's body. Nevertheless, the old man seemed to be still in a coma. This greatly surprised Natalie. At some point, the young woman even started thinking that he might not actually be in a coma. What if he's just pretending? But why would he do it? Natalie thought. The longer the young woman thought about it, the more she was inclined to think that Richard Young was playing everyone, including her. One day, the young woman plucked up her courage and approached the lying man, saying, "Mr. Young, sir, I know that you can hear me. It seems to me that you have come to your senses a long time ago, but for some reason you continue to pretend to be in a coma. If you have a secret or you need some kind of help, please know that you can trust me." Having finished her monologue, Natalie carefully looked into the old man's face, and to her bitter disappointment, she realized that he didn't even hear her. But when the woman was about to leave the room, she heard a quiet voice behind her. "Wait, don't go. I need to tell you something. The truth is, I've been pretending for about a month now, but I don't have a choice. I'm in danger, and so is my family." Natalie turned around and looked at the old man in surprise. At this point, she even started doubting whether the old man had lost his mind. But Richard Young wasn't paranoid at all, and everything he told Natalie a little later seemed both plausible and shocking. Of course, the young woman was a little bit offended by the fact that Francis lied to her and pretended to be poor. But having realized the true motives behind his lie, the young woman decided not to dwell on it. According to Richard Young, the accident on the mountains wasn't an accident at all. Someone had cut his rope. And 3 months before that, his only son Andrew died in a car accident that looked rather ridiculous and very suspicious. "But who would want to kill you?" Natalie asked. "I have my suspicions, but I need proof. I've written up a will a long time ago. In the event of my death, Francis would get all of my assets. Now think about it. Who's going to lose the most in this case?" "That's right, Amanda Young, my daughter-in-law, and Francis's stepmother," the old man explained. It was only then that Natalie realized what a horrible family she found herself involved in. All this time, Francis was almost never at home, as he was desperately trying to get the company back on its feet after his stepmother almost ruined it. At the request of Richard Young, Natalie kept the change in his condition secret from everyone. During the day, when there was just the two of them, the young caregiver and the old man talked about everything in the world. And when evening came, the patient continued to pretend to be in a coma. Most of Richard's family were sure that he'd drag out such a miserable existence until the end of his days. One day, having arrived at the Young's house a little early, Natalie heard voices coming from behind the loosely closed door of the old man's room. One of the people talking was Amanda Young, and the second was a man Natalie didn't know. "You have to be patient. He's going to die soon, and then I'll deal with my stepson, and we'll finally get to live our happily ever after," the woman said. "You've been saying that for a long time. The old man's been in a coma for 3 months. What are you waiting for?" the man objected. Only then did Natalie realize that Richard Young was absolutely right, and that his life and family were actually in danger. When the young woman went into the room, Amanda and her friend immediately stopped talking and pretended to be straightening the blanket over the old man's feet. Natalie greeted them as if nothing was wrong and started doing her job. Now she knew that the elderly businessman needed to be watched day and night. But the first thing Natalie did was call Francis on his business trip and tell him what she'd overheard. "I think you need to call the police before things get out of hand," Natalie suggested. Of course, she was right, especially since the man who came in with Amanda was most likely her lover. Unfortunately, the police didn't have enough evidence to open the case. After all, without evidence, Amanda Young looked like an inconsolable widow who was taking care of her adopted son and comatose father-in-law. Francis thought long and hard about what he could do. However, it was his grandfather who came up with the great solution. He'd always been a smart man. Richard Young asked his grandson to bring him a voice recorder so he could record Amanda talking to her lover the next time they'd come to visit him. They had to wait 3 days for it to happen. But when Amanda did come by, the recording Richard Young managed to make had all the evidence the police needed. Without even knowing it, Amanda testified against both herself and her lover. As it turned out, it was the devious couple who set up the accident for Richard's son, and then tried to kill Richard too. Thanks to the recording the old man made, the couple was detained the very next day. Richard Young could finally stop pretending to be in a coma and return to his normal life. Needless to say, Amanda was very surprised to see her father-in-law alive and well. Richard was beyond grateful to Natalie for her involvement in his case and for having restored his faith in people. At the same time, since the businessman knew about Natalie's grandmother's problems, he never failed to ask about her health. Since the young woman always kept pictures of her grandmother in her purse, she decided to show them to Richard Young. They pictured young Rosemary Hall. She was the slender beauty who was just learning her way around the farm. Taking one of the photographs in his hands, Richard Young took a closer look, after which he shuddered and changed in the face. "Grandpa, what's wrong with you? Are you feeling all right?" Francis exclaimed. Tears started flowing down Richard's cheeks, and no one knew why. "God, it's my Rosemary. It was so long ago, 40 or 45 years. The old man whispered, unable to stop crying. Everything cleared up a little later when Richard Young calmed down and told a story from his past. In fact, Richard Young and Rosemary Hall had known each other in their youth and were even in a relationship. But then, not without the help of the future millionaire's parents, they broke up and never saw each other again. But the main discovery was still ahead of Richard. He came to see Rosemary a week later when the woman was finished with her post-op treatment. Seeing the man that she used to love, the old woman couldn't hold back her tears. At that moment, Francis and Natalie quietly walked out of the room. Richard and Rosemary talked for about an hour and a half, after which they called their grandchildren into the room and told the young people that they were actually brother and sister. As it turned out, Richard was the father of Rosemary's son. Unfortunately, the old man never knew about his existence. All this time, Rosemary carefully kept this secret. Looking at each other, Natalie and Francis couldn't hold back their tears. Such an unexpected twist of fate turned everything upside down, and now they turned out to be siblings. On the other hand, there was nothing shameful in this, since family ties are always better than any kind of friendship. Later, Richard and Rosemary moved in together, and their grandchildren accepted their new reality and decided not to blame anyone for it. Rumors about this amazing story went around the city for a long time, proving yet again that life can be very unpredictable.